to ask it. Now, Tavis Gibbons says, what was the Spanish anarchist movement? Well, that's a very big question. Anarchism in Spain is something that's been around. I mean, there's still anarchists in Spain right up to today. But generally, when people refer to the Spanish anarchist movement, they're referring to prior to the Second World War, Spain had the Spanish Civil War, and that you had the rise of the Spanish Republic, and then you had the Spanish Civil War, and then eventually you had Franco's dictatorship that was in power until 1978, I believe, was when it fell. Maybe it was earlier than that or later, but you had Franco's dictatorship after that. Before Franco's dictatorship, Spain was very much a hotbed of leftism. So what you had is Spain. Spain is an interesting case study. Spain was one of the first colonizers, right? Spain colonized the Caribbean, colonized South America. And the wealth was coming into Spain from colonialism. And you had the merchant class emerging in Spain. And you had the Reformation taking place across Europe. And so Spain was a monarchy. It was a feudal society. But, Queen Isabella was sending Christopher Columbus and sending the conquistadors and all of that. And Spain took a U-turn, a very dramatic U-turn in the 1400s, the Inquisition. And Spain stopped moving toward capitalism. The Spanish aristocracy and feudalism and the Spanish Catholic Church, they said, stop, halt. They put on the brakes, and you had the Spanish Inquisition where a lot of people were burned at the stake, and they arrested a lot of the money lenders. Actually, Jews were heavily persecuted during the Spanish Inquisition because Jews lended money, right? And, in order to have capitalism, in feudalism, there is money, but most people aren't allowed to touch it, right? It used to be called filthy lucre, right? It was a sin to touch money if you were a Catholic in the feudal system. So Jews were this special group of people who handled money, right? And the Spanish Inquisition, they saw that Spain you started to have the rise of a merchant class, and you had conquistadors and all of that. And so in Spain, the feudal system saw a threat, and you had the Reformation going on, the Protestant Reformation happening in Germany and other places. And so in Spain, the feudal system went into all-out mode to defend itself. They burned a bunch of people at the stake. They started persecuting the Jews and killing the Jews during the Inquisition. And all of a sudden, Spain was not going to move toward capitalism. And that's why Spain was a big deal at the beginning of colonialism. And then it stopped. It didn't become a fully capitalist society. They put the brakes on it, and they maintained feudalism. Whereas Germany and Britain and France and America, you had capitalism rising in the Western world, but not in Spain. Spain held on to feudalism for a really long time, right? And that's why Spain was underdeveloped, right? It was much poorer in comparison to Britain and France and other countries. They didn't have a full-on change in property relations. They maintained peasants and serfs. They maintained feudalism. They maintained the monarchy. And that was Spain, they were underdeveloped, but Spain has a lot of mines in it. There's a lot of minerals and mining, and it was a big countryside, a lot of people. And in the 20th century, Spain had a revolution against feudalism, finally, right? And the peasants of Spain rose up, and the workers in the mines went on strike, and all over Spain, there was an uprising. The monarchy was brought down, and you had the Spanish Republic that came into existence. What year was the Spanish Republic created? All right, Spanish Republic, right? It was created in 1931. Finally, the Spanish monarchy was toppled. Feudalism was toppled. You had the Spanish Republic. And the struggle to overthrow feudalism in Spain was largely peasant uprisings, and this was actually the difference, right? So in Russia, right, you had a very big peasant movement, the Narodniks, they were called. And the Marxists, they organized the factory workers, the industrial workers, but the anarchists were the peasant movements. And actually, interestingly, if you go back, before World War II, back to the 1800s, back to the early 1900s, the first half of the 20th century, that was the difference between communists and anarchists. Communists, Marxists wanted to organize industrial workers to fight against their employers. And anarchists tend to organize peasants against oppression, right? Anarchism is a movement that opposes the state, right? That it's focused on not the economic question, but the question of social hierarchy, right? The peasant wants freedom from the noble, right? The peasant is told, you are the private property. You're a semi-slave. You're the private property of a noble. You have no rights. You have to work the land, and peasants are fighting for freedom. They want their own land. They want their own little tract of land. They want to own their own land and not be serfs anymore. And they want freedom from hierarchy. And peasant movements are focused on opposing authority rather than opposing, just simply fighting for the right of the worker on the job. They're fighting for, they want to have their own land and freedom, right? Land and they want their own land, and they want to fight against the very repressive feudal apparatus that holds them in semi-slavery. So peasants were, the peasant movements tended to be anarchist in their orientation. And there's a whole history of that. Bakunin, right, who was one of Marx's rivals, he organized uprisings in Spain among the peasantry. And in Russia, you had the Narodniks, and you had Peter Kropotkin, who was an organizer of the peasantry. He wrote The Conquest of Bread, and he was associated with peasant uprisings. And that anarchism was something peasants were attracted to. Now, among the people of Spain who rose up and overthrew the Spanish Republic, you generally had three currents, right? And this is the revolutionary movement, revolutionary politics in Europe at that time. Anti-capitalist politics generally had three strands. You had social democracy, which was the belief that socialism, a society without class oppression, grew naturally out of democracy. And once you establish democracy and elected government, it'll gradually, naturally lead to socialism, right? That the working class will outvote the capitalists, that it'll be one step at a time. That's called social democracy. That's the Second International. That's the British Labour Party. That's the French Socialist Party, the German Social Democratic Party. It's like out of the struggle for democracy, as a fulfillment of capitalist democracy, you get socialism, right? That's social democracy. And there were a lot of people that overthrew the Spanish Republic that believed once we have an elected government, we'll gradually create a classless society because we'll have the right to vote. Universal male suffrage. They weren't even thinking about giving women the right to vote. Universal male suffrage, right? That's social democracy. Then you have communism, or Marxism, Leninism, which says it's a struggle to seize control of the state. The revolutionary working class must take control of the state. It's not enough to just have a democracy, right? That you want a revolutionary working class. The working class must establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, must seize control of the state. And then you have another current, which is anarchism, right? Which says we're not interested in political power at all, right? We're not trying to seize political power. We're not trying to, gradually reform political power. We're just going to do our own thing. That's anarchism. And for peasants, that meant we're just going to we're going to overthrow our landlords, overthrow the rural aristocracy, overthrow the landlord. We're going to set up a little commune, and we're just going to do it ourselves. We don't need the government to give us the land. We don't need, we're just going to do it ourselves, right? The rural communes. And that was a big thing in Russia. The Narodniks, they were called. And Peter Kropotkin, in his book, The Conquest of Bread, right? Peter Kropotkin was this Russian anarchist, and he went around buying up land, and the idea was the peasants would voluntarily work on this land, and it would be like a model kind of egalitarian rural commune of the peasantry, right? And among factory workers, the anarchist movement says we're not trying to elect socialists to the government. We're not trying to build a movement to eventually seize power. We're just going to build our own union to fight against our employer, and our union will eventually seize control of the factory. And we're not interested in politics at all. It's purely an economic struggle, right? That is the anarchist movement. So in Spain, as you overthrew the Spanish monarchy and you had the Republic, you had social democrats, you had the Communist Party, which was inspired by the Soviet Union, which was a very big party, and you had the anarchists, and the anarchists were very popular among the peasantry. Now, after the overthrow of the monarchy, the Republic comes into existence, and the Communist Party and the Socialist Party have a lot of seats in the government, and the anarchists have a lot of peasants who support them, and there's labor unions that are aligned with the communists, labor unions that are aligned with social democrats, labor unions that are aligned with the anarchists. I think the anarchist, the anarchist labor union was called this. What is it? The CNT. Yeah, the Confederation National Trabajo, the workers, the union, the National Workers Union, the CTN, or the CNT, was the labor union affiliated with the anarchists. They didn't vote. They didn't participate in elections. They just, the peasants were organizing for their own land, the workers in the factories, etc. The Communist Party had seats in the parliament, etc. So what happened? The Spanish Republic was this very radical coalition that included some people that didn't want any kind of socialism, a lot of capitalists who just believed in having an elected government, and the socialists and the communists and the anarchists. They're all part of this Spanish Republic. Well, what happens? Well, there's a general named Franco, General Francisco Franco, who's in North Africa. Spain has colonies in North Africa. And he's in North Africa and Tunisia and places like that. And he's a colonizer, right? He's colonizing people for Spain. And he says, oh no, we're going to bring the monarchy back, right? The monarchy is the sacredness of Spain. And he loves the Catholic Church. And he feels a lot of these communists and anarchists or whatever are against the Catholic Church because they view the Catholic Church as oppressing people. And he says, I'm going to protect the Catholic Church, and I'm going to bring back the king and the monarchy. And so he brings his army from North Africa into Spain, and he's going to overthrow the Spanish Republic and create a fascist dictatorship called his political movement's called Falangismo, or the Phalangists, right? The Phalange, right? And they're going to build this fascist movement, right? That is going to bring the king back and crush the Spanish Republic. Now, the question is, so what do you do about it? Well, the Communist Party says we must build an anti-fascist coalition. The Soviet Union supported the Spanish Republic and sent them all kinds of guns and weapons. Mexico supported the Spanish Republic, but largely the Western countries didn't support the Spanish Republic. And there were differences within the Spanish Republic. How do we go about fighting the fascists? And the communists, their position was we need to support the Spanish Republic, and we need to get guns from the Soviet Union, and we need to build a united front, and we need to bring in international volunteers. Thousands of people from all over the world went to Spain to fight to defend the Republic, and that was their position. The anarchists, the CNT, and the Trotskyists, the POUM, the POUM, they said that in order to really defeat fascism, we have to overthrow capitalism entirely. And that we don't want to unite with the capitalists that are against the fascists. In fact, we want to overthrow them. And the anarchists in particular said that we need to fight against the Catholic Church, right? So the Catholic Church was very divided. There were some Catholics that said, you know what, this Spanish Republic is full of communists. It's bad. We support fascism. There were some Catholics that said, you know what, maybe we don't agree with some people, but we don't want to have a fascist dictatorship. The Catholic Church was very divided. The anarchists of Spain viewed the Catholic Church as the enemy. So what the anarchists of Spain were doing is they were going around in the countryside. They were seizing parts of the countryside to establish kind of model worker farmer communities, right? And they were waging peasant uprisings in the countryside. Whereas the communists were saying, don't do that. Let's all just come together to defend the Republic from Franco. So there was a big difference between the anarchists and the communists in Spain, because some of the communists are saying, let's just hold this all together. We'll align with liberal and anti-fascist Catholics. We'll make an alliance with capitalists that are anti-fascist. We're building an anti-fascist united front. The anarchists are saying, no, we're going to overthrow capitalism and we're going to set up model anarchist communities in the countryside. And that was the division. Now, the problem was the anarchist peasant uprisings were very anti-Catholic because the Catholic Church was seen as propping up feudalism. The Catholic Church told people to obey their landowners, that, the noble is given divine right to rule over you by God. And so when the anarchists would seize control of an area, they would brutally retaliate against the Catholic Church. And is it possible some of this is exaggerated? Of course, right? The fascists made horrendous propaganda everywhere, but it happened at least a few places. They would very brutally murder priests and nuns, and they would crucify them. They would rape nuns, right? And they would crucify priests, like Jesus is crucified. They would nail they was very brutal retaliation. And you see this all over the world. Whenever peasants rise up, they're mad. Peasants are mad, angry motherfuckers. All right. The French Revolution, right? All the guillotine and the chopping off the heads. That was peasants in France. When peasants get mad, peasants have a lot of anger, right? Peasants have no rights. They're not allowed to look the landowner in the face. They have different words they can use. They're raised from the time they're children to believe somebody else has the divine right to rule over them. And when peasants finally rebel, it's ugly, right? And they take revenge like you wouldn't believe. And Pol Pot in Cambodia, he led a peasant uprising where they murdered all the educated people for having glasses. Well, they have privilege. We're going to kill them, right? The French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Peasants, when peasants rise up, it's nasty because peasants are very, very, very oppressed. And their targets tend to be the church, the nobility, the state, the government, right? They're not waging an economic struggle. They're waging a struggle against authority, right? And so the peasants in Spain, when they would take over an area, there'd be priests and nuns there, and they viewed the Catholic Church as the institution that held up their oppression. So they cut people's heads off and nailed people to crosses and raped people. And they were pretty nasty motherfuckers, all right? They did some pretty nasty, horrendous atrocities against the Catholic Church. And of course, the fascists, Hitler and Mussolini and Franco, made propaganda about that, and they blasted it all over the world. Well, this is what's happening in Spain, and that's why it really kind of contributed to the fact that America and France and all of them didn't support the Spanish Republic. The Soviet Union and Mexico were the only two countries in the world that supported the Spanish Republic. And so the communists were trying to stop the anarchists. And there was the Battle of Catalonia, where the Trotskyites of POUM and the anarchists of the CNT fought against the Spanish Republic, led by communists. And there was a lot of anarchists who got executed, and there was a lot of Trotskyites who got executed because the communists were trying to hold the Republic together. The anarchists were trying to build model communities in the countryside and trying to take revenge against the Catholic Church. It's now been revealed that the anarchists of Spain and the Trotskyites of Spain were being supported by Hitler. They were what they call the fifth column, right? That when Franco invaded Barcelona, he said, I have 4 columns outside the city, but inside the city, I have the 5th column. And that's the people that are trying to confuse the country from within, trying to sow unrest. The Trotskyites and the anarchists were being covertly supported by the fascists because it would undermine the Republic. It would sow division within the Republic. George Orwell, he was the guy who wrote 1984. He went to Spain and he fought with the Trotskyites, and he was part of the uprising against the Spanish Republic. He even wrote a book about it, The Battle of Catalonia, or The Homage to Catalonia. Well, it's no secret. George Orwell, not only was he a virulent anti-communist, he wrote Animal Farm in 1984. George Orwell was also a British intelligence officer, and he worked for the Ministry of Information, the British government propaganda services during World War II. I mean, George Orwell was this famous British writer who was kind of a leftist. He wrote about poverty, down and out in Paris and London. And, he was this well-known British intellectual writer who was kind of a leftist, but he was an anti-communist. And he worked with the Trotskyites. And then he became an official government propagandist for the British government. And then after World War II, he wrote 2 anti-communist screeds that we all have to read in school, 1984 and Animal Farm, which gets spoon-fed to school children in America. And he was probably working with the British intelligence services at the time he was in Spain. I mean, that can't be proven necessarily, but he was an anti-communist. He was with the Trotskyites who waged this uprising against the Spanish Republic. And, anarchists in Spain, they get romanticized. They really do get romanticized. And they did good things. They were fighting for the peasants, etc. But they also did some pretty bad things. And that their behavior very significantly contributed to the rise of Franco, right? And that the communists were doing everything they could to unify Spain against Franco, and the anarchists were doing everything they could to create violence. And actually, if you talk to anti-communists, a lot of them think it was the communists that were raping the nuns and all of that, right? People that are not on the left don't understand these differences, right? And, this is one thing, right, that, to normies, all communists look the same, right? They're all the same, right? They don't know the difference between Trotskyites, anarchists, the Communist Party, and standard, right-wing Catholic propaganda is communists were raping nuns, and that's why you had to have Franco's dictatorship, because the communists in Spain were so bad, right? People don't understand the nuances of the Communist Party was trying to stop the anarchists, and People don't understand any of this nuance, right? And I mean, when I go to conferences around the world with, conservatives and, anti-Israel conservatives, and they always say, oh, yes, well, it was the communists were so bad. That's why Franco had to do this. Well, it wasn't the communists. It was the anarchists. It was the Trotskyites, but they don't understand that there's a difference because it's just the left, right? The Spanish Republic was this big communist mess, and it wasn't communist. There was a lot of capitalists in the Spanish Republic, and they don't understand. It was just the Spanish Republic was full of all these evil communists that hated the church and hated the Catholics, and that's the narrative that they have. And look, I will say this, right? One thing about the left, which is part of why I'm neither left nor right. I'm an innovationist. Part of the problem with the left, one way to make sure that the left loves you is lose, right? If you want to be loved by the left, lose, right? Because if you lose, you never take power. There's no problem defending you, right? There's a million books about Eugene Debs because he never took power. There's a million books about the IWW. They never took power. They weren't connected to any state. Fine. There's all kinds of people. You go to the left forum, there's all kinds of academics writing about Rosa Luxemburg. She lost, right? There's all kinds of people writing about various anarchist leaders in Spain because they lost. They never set up a government. But once you set up a government, like the Venezuelans have, like the Nicaraguans have, like Stalin did, like China, all of a sudden you're in power. And so you're going to be accused of violating human rights, and you're going to be called a dictatorship. And suddenly defending you means you have to have some courage, and you have to say that the New York Times is full of lies and all of that. But a lot of these leftists are so crazy that in their mind, right, there's a million of these, right? Whether it's Rosa Luxemburg, whether it's, whether it's the anarchists of Spain, whether it's Trotsky, if only my guy had been in power, it would have been good socialism. But if only Rosa Luxemburg had taken power in Germany, it would have been real socialism that wasn't authoritarian and wasn't repressive, wasn't violating human. If only the anarchists of Spain, if only Che Guevara had taken power instead of Fidel Castro. I've heard that one too, which is pretty crazy, right? If only if only this person who lost took power, then it would be okay. But unfortunately, it was evil Stalin and evil Mao and evil Kim Il-sung and evil Fidel. They took power and they violated human rights. And that's why communism doesn't work. And that's why everything we've been told about communist governments is true. It's because these people. But if only this loser, I hate to put it that way, I don't want to call them losers. These are great people usually who made great sacrifices. But if only this empty vessel I've found somewhere, only they had taken power, it would have been good. And that is a classic example of leftist, it's that not real socialism thing, right? It's like it's the right-wing caricature. If you lay out standard anti-communist lies and they say, well, that just wasn't real socialism, and it's like the most extreme example of that. The anarchists in Spain, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, Che Guevara, and some of these people were very good people. I admire Rosa Luxemburg. I quote her work, but she lost. She died. She didn't take power. So people can project onto her. If only she had taken power, it would have been this way. And there's no risk in supporting her. If Rosa Luxemburg had won in Germany and actually taken power and become the leader of Germany, there would have been people trying to overthrow her, and she would have had to repress them. And some of them would have gotten away and fled to Britain or America, and they would have said, Rosa Luxemburg is an evil dictator who's oppressing people and and we would all be taught in school that Rosa Luxemburg was a mass murdering, bloodthirsty Stalinist, and none of these idiots would support her. But she lost, and so because she lost, it's okay to support her. Right? When you let your enemy tell you who you're allowed to support and who you're not, this is why I don't want to be a leftist anymore. Right? And I'm just telling you, anarchists in Spain, a lot of them were very heroic. A lot of them made great sacrifices, and they fought for the peasantry, and they did a lot of great things. A lot of them also did things that really hurt the Spanish Republic. They committed horrendous atrocities against the Catholic Church. They did awful things that contributed to the Spanish Republic losing. But the point is, they lost. They were in power for what? A year, a month. They had set up the commune here. They set up the model city there, but they lost. And because they lost, of course they would be real socialism. I mean, and that's the problem with the left. And this is why the left, it's like the so-called anti-Stalinist left. During the Cold War, the US government started funding the anti-Stalinist left. This is openly admitted. The anti-Stalinist left is, it's beyond just that they're scared to support anybody who actually won. It's so far beyond that. You read Fascinating Fascism by Susan Sontag. You read what the Congress for Cultural Freedom. You read the stuff in Partisan Review magazine that printed George Orwell and printed Hannah Arendt. It's not just that they can't bring themselves to support the Stalinists who won. It's that they don't want to. They're against winners. Like, they think strength is fascist. Okay, they've totally they have a mindset that is based on, I want to be the other. I want to be the persecuted victim. I want to see myself as the great individual oppressed by the mob, and it fits neoconservatism like a glove, right? And it's they want they identify with anything that is weak, and anything that is strong or is winning, they're triggered by, right? And it fits neoconservatism and the neoconservative anti-populist view of Leo Strauss put forward in his philosophical writing, Persecution and the Art of Writing by Leo Strauss. It fits it like a glove, right? And that the anti-Stalinist left, they can't attach themselves to anything real, because then they would be the oppressors. They're not putting forward a political position. They are the permanent opposition. They are against the masses of people. They have taken on an identity of being the permanent other, the permanent opposition, of being in fear and in opposition to the masses of people. And it's a hard thing to understand. It's taken me years. I mean, I spent my entire adult life in communist groups. I'm 38 years old. And I've seen how dysfunctional they are. And I've been to actual anti-imperialist countries, and I have dedicated my life to being an anti-imperialist. And I'm telling you, it's taken me years to understand that leftism has degenerated into a mindset that can only support losers. They can only support people who lost. They can only support people they perceive as weak. The woke, they love minorities because they see minorities as weak. And the second that a minority starts to show strength, they don't like them anymore, right? They'll tell you how much they love black people. Black people are so oppressed, and they're poor victims. Go read To Kill a Mockingbird, right? In To Kill a Mockingbird, this book written by a white woman, the hero is a rich white lawyer with a heart of gold, and the black people are just these poor oppressed victims who could never fight for their own rights. But these same liberals, if they ever see Minister Farrakhan, ooh, they hate him. And Chairman O'Malley of the Uhuru movement, ooh, they hate him. They like people and things they perceive as weak. And the second that someone from an oppressed group stops being perceived as weak, they don't like them anymore. Right? I mean, they hate black nationalism. They hate Minister Farrakhan. They hate the Uhuru movement. I have never seen it. You'd think, well, I mean, how is it that these woke people, their entire worldview is based on, we are against the American system and we stand with black people. So the American government goes after a black socialist group, raids their home, drags an 83-year-old man into federal court and charges him with being a Russian agent. So you'd think every woke person in the world, every single one of these woke people would have been there at the Tampa federal courthouse to say this is wrong, and they stand against it. Well, if you think that, you're wrong. Tucker Carlson supported them. I supported them, and we had UN press conferences. I raised their case at the UN multiple times. I raised their case in Russia. But they didn't get any support. All these woke people hate the Uhuru movement. I heard on the internet that it's a call. I heard that it's a call on the internet. I heard they didn't support the Democrats. And these woke people, how are these woke people intellectually consistent? Why couldn't they support the Uhuru movement? Because they're a strong movement. They project strength. Chairman O'Malley is 80 years old, and he's the most well-built, muscular guy I've ever seen. They build farmers markets. They build solid organizations in the black community. They empower people. They're not weak. They're not perceived as weak. Woke people, it's like, they would support Chairman O'Malley if he had gone to prison. Right? If they'd lost the case and they'd been dragged into prison, then they would support them because they'd perceive them as weak. It's this weird, leftism has become this mindset where you can only support the anarchists of Spain. You can only support Rosa Luxemburg. You can only support Trotsky because they lost. You can't support anyone who actually wins. It is a crazy mindset, right? The second that somebody wins, the New York Times is going to say that they committed human rights violations. They're going to have military parades, like I just showed you from North Korea, and they're going to look strong. And oh my God, then they're the oppressor. This is leftism has become a mindset, a damaged mindset where you can't support anyone who actually won. And I hope I'm not offending you, Tavis. I'm just telling you how it is. I'm just being real with you. And so you ask about the anarchists of Spain. I gave you the history and I gave you my understanding that the reason that they are a fetish among American leftists is because they lost. It's because they lost, and because of our movement, leftism as a movement in the West is mind fucked. I don't know how to put it in any other way. And that's a very, very long answer. I should probably clip this. It's a very long answer to your question. But that's what the anarchists of Spain are, and that's why they are a fetish in leftist circles in the West.